we can start now. So welcome to School of Governance, Law and Society. Even though we are in virtual reality, as it has been like a new reality for us, for everybody, for last year already. So we also try to develop further our academic activities, still using these electronical methods. And I'm very glad that our common project has continued what we have done in what we have actually started already five years ago. It's called SOGOLAS Global Forum. It's School of Governance, Law and Society's Global Forum, where we are we have held several conferences and seminars in the most topical issues of the world. And of course, also today, we're absolutely happy to welcome here Professor Nadia Urbinati, who is from Columbia University from the United States. And we will speak about, or Nadia is going to speak about the democracy in the United States and the issues of populism, also connected with the developments of democracy. And as you all know, from the last half a year, or since November, since the presidential elections in America, and the developments after that has brought America into a kind of crisis. We have to say that it has been hugely discussed also in academic circles all over the world, and I think also today's event will be very academically fruitful discussion, and I'm absolutely pleased to welcome all other commentators, also Professor Sharman and Professor Millerson, and we also have Estonian commentator Liisa Past, who I hope also is joining us in the discussions and comments later on. So welcome to Tallinn virtually. We are in Estonia. At least our station is in Estonia, and most of us are probably in Estonia, but now it is also virtual reality, so we don't have any territorial issues, at least now when we're doing it through Zoom. And Professor Massimo Latorre, who is also the heart and the soul behind all the series of events that we have had in Estonia, is also the chairman of this event today. So now I give the word also to Professor Latorre to continue and to chair this beautiful and academically fruitful seminar. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Injek. Thank you very much, Professor Grauberg. Professor Grauberg is the director of our institute, an institute addressing questions of governance, society, and law. And in the framework of this institute, the University of Tallinn, we built this forum, which is meant as space to discuss, so to say, the spirit of time, so zeitgeist, we could say in German, using the very famous Hegel formulation. Now, this is the second seminar we are organizing in the framework of this forum. The first one was held in February by Professor Yves Meny, We started with Professor Meni. Professor Meni was president of the European University Institute, well-known political scientist, and the subject was populism and somehow connected with pandemics. So, and I think it is very fortunate that as a second seminar we have now Professor Nadia Urbinati. Nadia Urbinati is an Italian scholar, but she has done, I believe, all her career in the United States at the Columbia University in New York, very prestigious university. And she has written extensively in the last years about populism. I remember 2 books. I remember the first book in 2014, Democracy Disfigured, and then a most recent book, Me the People, 2019. So I think we have the best possible scholar to discuss together with us the question of what's going on in the United States in connection with this spreading over of populist movements and populist challenge, so to say, to representative democracy. Actually, representative democracy is one of the core of Professor Urbinati's research projects. Well, I think I have to thank very much Professor Urbinati for being here with us, for having accepted our invitation. And now the best thing I can do is to give her the floor. So thank you very much, Nadia. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Massimo. Thank you, Indrek and Bill and Bart and Christopher, everybody who's here, Terry. Now, my presentation was somehow inspired by the paper that Bill gave last fall when he presented us. I remember the discussion, the issue of what went wrong with Trumpism, and he insisted most on the institutional organization of the state, the constitution. I would like to move my direction toward the outside of the institution and see how populism really can be part of a democratic process. It's not outside, and however, how complicated it is to control its implications and outcomes. And in fact, it would be interesting to see precisely the January the 6th, 2021 as an important explication of the threshold between a regime and another one, and the threshold defined as the one possible consequences of populism in power. So in some sense, the Trump case is an important case for us to better understand the trajectory that a democracy can make toward the outside, that is toward another regime, and what we have to pay attention to see that
Nadia, your microphone, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. And with the and in my view, does we should analyze populism from inside of the democratic process and to understand these potential implications. So my paper is, my presentation is very simple in some sense. I like to use Trumpism to illustrate populism in power. Not populism as a movement in civil society or as a movement of opinion or as a party, but populism in power. So, and analyze this populism as in his rhetorical style, but above all in his propaganda and tropes and ideology, and finally to see the aims and achievements. It will appear, at least I hope so, that the representative construction of the people is rhetorical and independent of social classes and traditional ideology. It is a creation of his own. and that finally, that populist democracy is a form of representative government that is based on two phenomena, which we saw very well and clearly with Trump: a direct relation between the leader and those in society the leader declares to be the good people or the right people. And second, the superlative authority of the public or the audience as a quasi-new sovereign power. So finally, we can see that the immediate targets of populism in power are the obstacles to the development of two phenomena. I mean, in some sense, two are the so-called adversaries that the populists in government or in power declare to be so. One are the intermediary opinion making bodies from political parties in the traditional sense and the established media, and on the other end, the institutionalized systems for monitoring and controlling political power. Now, concerning populism, until recently, it was identified as a phenomenon belonging to not stabilized democracy or to the periphery of the so-called West. Recently, particularly after the collapse of the Cold War and moreover the new century, we witness a kind of pan-populist phenomenon all over the places in the West, from Washington to Caracas, from Budapest to Rome. And this means that also the phenomenon, especially since the election of Donald Trump in the United States, the perception of in relation to populism changed, and thus we cannot avoid in the West to consider populism as a possible destiny also in the West, and not only in those so-called marginal or peripheral situation or countries. Now, and since thus populism has become a catchword for describing what for many scholars is a troubling problems in contemporary democracy, we cannot avoid it, to discuss about it, to try to understand it, and above all, because populism is sometimes used as identified with other recurrent words: fascism, authoritarianism, ethno-nationalism, nativism, and finally Trumpism. So in the word populism, there are in effect different other words mixing sometimes, and I think we should resist to inflate these words so as to include so many other categories and regimes that are separated from populism and are separated from democracy also. Now, in this presentation, I don't use the language of crisis, and I don't even use the language of anti-democracy. I don't think that this is a form of reaction against democracy. It is instead a risk, a permanent risk possible within democracy against forms of expression and manifestation of democracy, particularly through elections and political parties. So Trump or Trumpism is exemplary of the ambiguity and the risk that can develop from inside of democracy, even if, in my view, it is problematic to identify it with fascism, as I said already. And I tend to separate the two and to keep them separated, even if in the language, this form of populism is aggressive against independent media, is aggressive and humiliating against the political opposition, and even if it somehow poisons the fabric of public discourse, introducing element of factionalism and intolerance. Yet this is, in my view at least, not yet enough for declaring that Trumpism or populism are forms of fascism and not of democracy instead. Also because, not only because fascism goes together with violence, but we saw that also Trumpist was very connected to violent manifestations, even if he used violence as a proxy and not himself, not Trumpism itself promoted it directly. Although thus fascism is connected to violence in much more direct way, and fascism does something that populism doesn't. Fascism suspend the risk of being put in the opposition. Fascism suspends elections, populism doesn't. And it is precisely in the electoral risk of being of losing power that we have to pay attention to see the specificity. And this is what I would like to do. And thus, in the main body of this presentation, I will try to clarify my conception of populism. And then at the end, I will go directly to Trump again to see how it is, how what happened on January the 6th, that is the assault on the Capitol, was somehow a predicted the risk inside of his very inaugural speech. Although we cannot anticipate the future, certainly in that speech I will show in the inaugural, in that inaugural address, there are all the elements that help us to understand populism, and also anticipated a possible outcome of that disgraceful 4 years government. Now, a long story that before reaching January the 6th, I like to remind us that this story of populism also in America is a long one, is not a short one. In the present time, it has to do with the admission practically that the democracy based on parties and democracy based on election is a failure as a democracy, because it is not a good or a pure democracy, but is in fact a way of constructing an establishment. So behind the attack of populism on party democracy, or the so-called establishmentarianism, there is the sense that democracy by plural parties and pluralism to elections is a smart and way for taking away power from the people by fragmenting the unity of the people, by creating through election another elite on the top of the people capable of manipulating opinion, and thus also transforming what is only in name a democracy and de facto is a form of oligarchy. This attack against establishment and the dualism between the few and the many that the establishment simply represents is traditional and cyclical in all populist rhetoric in US and elsewhere. In a book recently published by Rosenbluth and Shapiro, in effect, the success of Trumpism has been connected to the decline or the misfortune of organized parties in the United States, also because of the institutionalization of the open primaries to elect parties candidate, a move that, according to Rosenbluth and Shapiro, had made the personalization and the plebiscitarization of politics easier, thus transforming politics into a question of communication experts who concoct propaganda and messages in order to elect the leader that best can collect many different claims, thus preparing for a kind of populistic outcome, since there are no longer oppositional parties, but leaders capable of attracting votes from everywhere, and thus proposing by itself this moribund party democracy, proposing itself as a kind of anticipation of what it will be then a populist government. I cannot go through the other extra political or external to politics factors of populism, from economic inequality, globalization, immigrations, and so on and so forth. So I presume a corpus of analysis that cannot be comprised within the political analysis I would like to propose, but that presumes this richness of socioeconomic and cultural factors that we have to keep in mind all the time when we talk about populism. So Trumpism thus can be used to illustrate the populism power in strong democracy, or in established democracy, not in the peripheral. But the characteristic I would like to stress is that in fact, there is no much difference between peripheral and central democracies when we deal with populism. As populism has specificity of different in each country and in each part of the globe, certainly, because it expresses political, rhetorical, and cultural specificity. But apart from these obviously contextualized specificities, there is in populism, no matter whether it's in Washington or in Caracas, some similarities that are recognizable, so that there is, in some sense, no exceptionalism in the American Trumpism from the point of view of the manifestation of the populist trope, which are the same, in some sense, the same that you can find also elsewhere. Now, I have to say that the relationship of the American scholars with populism is, however, specific and very different from the one that we can find, for instance, in Europe. There is a kind of benign attitude toward populism since, as we know, populism was born not only originally in Russia, as we know very well, in the 19th century, but after Russia, it was born certainly as a political movement, not as a movement of intellectuals against modernization as in Russia, but a political movement aiming at acquiring a majority. It was born in the United States as a party, the People's Parties, as we know, in 1892, with an important message that is remained persistent through the ages. That is the idea of the desire of moral regeneration of the public, and the redemptive aspiration of democracy, and the dualism between folk politics and institutionalized politics. Or if you want to say so, the idea that politics needs to recuperate the connections with the experience of the local and ordinary people, far away from the palazzo and the establishment of the capital or the Washington DC in this case. So there was already, starting with the 19th century, the dualism of that is so important in populism between the general public and the corrupt few. This dualism has been not something invented recently, is part, if you want to say so, internal to the foundation of the American Republic. And if you want, well, there is time we would like to discuss, if we want, we can discuss this, within the Republican rhetoric itself, by even classical republicanism. This idea of the people as a plebs or opposed to the Senate as a duality is inside of the Republican rhetoric and history, and it is also inside the American history, in particular, recent history of the 19th, 20th century. Now, American populists thus display this dualism, folk and institutions, external people and establishment. And this was already rooted, as I said, at the origin of the Federal Republic, and would re-emerge even during the New Deal and even after the New Deal. So that populism is cyclical somehow, and it's not only one time in a moment, like in the Trump case. It was, in some sense, populism sometimes is referred as the ancestral people at the beginning of the organization of the Federation and the Republic. But certainly the interpretation was instead different. For instance, with the Cold War, sympathies toward this ancestral populism declined, and the liberal intellectuals and historians, they twisted the meaning of American populism to transform its old progressiveness that had tradition in the 19th century to see instead this progressive populism declined and no longer part of the game. This belonged to a past. Once liberal democracy stabilized, particularly in the dualism against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, once these democratic liberalism stabilized, then the message coming from populism stopped having a positive implication. So in a famous conference in 1967 in London on populism, which was managed by and organized by Isaiah Berlin with Richard Hofstadter, it appeared clearly that the good time of the good populism was over. Along with the stabilization of democracy. According to Richard Hofstadter, thus, who wrote Under the Shadow of McCarthyism, populism as progressivism had already gone after the World War I. After which it took the semblance of a pure reaction against modernization and lost its pristine moralizing characteristics. According to Hofstadter, thus, from the New Deal onward, the name of populism came to be associated with nationalism and the reaction against immigrant invasions, as well as against all forms of public policies and state intervention for redistribution, thus against the bureaucratic regulation or so-called welfarism somehow. In Hofstadter reconstruction, thus, the positive implication of populism were practically gone, and they belong to a past that antedated liberal democracy. Once we have a liberal democracy, which means for Hofstadter, a social economy autonomous from the state, and moreover, the acceptance of a large middle class and an active regulatory state, mass consumption and affordable well-being for the many, all this package meant was the equivalent of liberal democracy according to Hofstadter. Once we have this as the outcome of the New Deal, practically, populism became, according to him, the name of something often nostalgic for a past that was over and was not longer an object of nostalgia, but in effect a kind of myth of a pristine democracy or pristine, American greatness that it would be good to retrieve again. So when does Trump used to talk about let's make America great again, it was somehow in the language or in that language that according to Hofstadter would be a language of a past that was not certainly good to have it back. So there is a sense that, at least in this Hofstadter in the 60s, the sense that populism represents a kind of desire to go to a path that is no longer desirable to have back. In the name of a Manichaeanism and exclusionary conception of the good country that smells exclusion, smells nativism, smells repression against minorities. Now, thus, it would seem, it seemed in the 60s, according to Hofstadter and company, that de facto populism was either domesticated and it became a kind of strong majority like many other, along with other majorities, or simply declined. So it seemed that the time of populism was over in the West, particularly in the consolidated democracy kind of West. Even Margaret Canavan, in a very important series of articles, and particularly in the book she wrote on the People, she divides populism into two parts. Populism in economically backward countries or societies, in which populism could be stretched even to produce form of Caesarism or strong leaderism, like caudillism, with problematic authoritarian implications, and instead populism in modern Western society. And she says, in these cases, in the United States or Great Britain, in these cases, populism almost becomes indistinguishable from electoral cases of so-called silent majorities or catch-all parties majorities. Now, the question is that Trumpism puts an end to this interpretation. Populism can come back in very strong democracies. Populism can have very antipathetic manifestations also in strong democracy. And it's not the case that populism is disconnected with the strong leadership. It is not simply a catch-all parties silent majority phenomenon. So Trumpism shows that all populist leaders have something in common, whether they come from the West or in the periphery of the West, whether they come from Latin American or not. And thus, I tend to agree with Federico Finkelstein that populism, although has a history that is different in different times and moments and national experiences, however, there is a kind of, they have important zones of confluence, important overlaps. And these overlaps is connected to the way in which they use majority, the way in which they use election, the way in which they use representation. And although there are different stories of populism in different countries, these kind of specificity of populism is recognizable wherever we see it. And it is a form, I theorize elsewhere, I argue elsewhere, it is a form of disfiguration of the very style of democracy in relation to the main fundamentals of democracy, which are three. The people, the majority rule, and representation is mandate representation. In all these three important fundamentals, we recognize populism in power because there is a transformation of these categories in something that is recognizable as populistic. We don't have other names to express a form of democracy that is dangerously prominent to become very close to a change of a regime, although it's not yet a change of a regime. So if we have in our mind the classification of democracy that Aristotle proposed in politics, in his politics, from a constitutional system to a demagoguery, which is the final station before a tyrannical or a despotical solution, we may say that populism indeed belongs, once in power, can belong to the stretching moment, the last stage before something else may happen. Why so? And this has to do with the rhetoric and the strategic organization of discourse that belongs to populism. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, populist politics is a type of politics that seeks to represent the wishes of ordinary people, I quote, who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. So here we have three important words to keep in mind. First, the ordinary people. Second, the established groups. And third, the feeling uniting the two. So the ordinary people and the establishment are connected by this feeling that a leader intercepts, exalts, and narrates in order to construct his own leadership. And we may even consider populism as a way of circulation of elite or change of elite through these strategies. So populism involves thus an exclusionary conception of the people, so that the elite or the established groups are not part of it. And for this reason, I think that the classical Republican trope is very important here, because is a dual kind of sovereignty here, the people and the others who people are not, and they are like the patricians, or today, in today's language, the established groups of people. So thus, populism involves an exclusionary conception of the people and an inclusionary one. So those who are inside needs to be molded into one general group. So there is this holistic characteristic of the people as not internally articulated into a plurality. This plurality, according to all populist leaders, is a way of making the people weak. So if we want to make the people strong, we need to overcome this internal plurality and unify the people into one. As we know, Ernesto Laclau was spectacularly good in explaining, justifying, and theorizing this phenomenon. According to him, the best example of democratic politics, which consists for him in the narrative, in the constructive narrative of the collective people. Now, if this is the case, then we can understand why all populist movements and leaders, they need to enter in a direct relation to his people. And we understand why the intermediation between them and the people is something they dislike, they don't like, they try to eliminate. Thus, populism, particularly today, in which the new media are capable of making us bypass intermediary institutions like parties or other associations, in today's technological organization of the media, it is possible to make this jump from the people from the leader to the people without any difficulty. So populists have today they enjoy the privilege of a civilization that gives them technology capable that allow them to enter in direct relation to the people, to create what I defined as direct representation, representing the people directly without the intermediary association of the party. And this allows us to see why all the populist leaders, from Chavez to Berlusconi to Salvini to Trump, they spend day and night in a dialogue with the people without any intermediation in between. This allows them to present representation. I'm sorry, a game of words, to present representation as a new way of creating the people by direct incarnation of the leader and the people. So the people is incarnating the leader, and the leader is the people. This is a trope that all populists have and represent. Also Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I will come back to this at the end when I'll discuss the the address that he gave on January 17, 2017, when he declared to be the people, practically, and to have the people there in Washington, D.C., and not himself. So somehow, populism construct these, the populist leader construct these representation of himself as the incarnation of the people, and in doing so, if he does something that is the unpleasant moment, in my view, that is the transformation of the people from a principle of legitimacy, thus people as a formal legal formality or a fictio juris, as we used to say, that is inclusive of all those who live in the country, to transform these general people into a determined people with some specificity, connected to a nation, connected to a race, connected to a religion, and this makes the most inclusionary, exclusionary implication of the people. So in this way, once the people acquire, thanks to the leader, the ability of governing the country, it will govern, and they govern. All populists, they do the same in Italy or in the United States or in Venezuela. They govern as if the people is the owner of the government, because the right people, the people in which name the Constitution is declared, needs to have the direct action on the governance of the institutions. And thus the distance between institution and those who operate in the institutions, this distance, this gap tends to be closed in order to declare that one people rule the institutions and outside of the institution is the same people. Now, this is a twisted way of conceiving the people that transform the people into a majority that change the meaning of the majority rule. So if the majority is the principle according to which we in a democracy declare the winner of an election, and thus the legitimate part of the people who are supposed to govern temporarily the country, if we have the substantialization of the people and the specification of the people into a part of the population with some specific characteristics, also the majority is going to change. It's no longer a principle or a method, but it becomes reified into a specific part of the people, the good one. At that point, the right people ruling the country has also the ambition of declaring itself to be in the right side, in the right moment, in the right place, using the right institutions, and for these reasons, to leave the institutions if they lose election becomes a problem. So I come with the Trump's words. He said, "We, the citizens of America, are now joined in a great national effort to rebuild our country and to restore its promise for all of our people. Together, we will determine the course of America and the world for years to come. We will face challenges, we will confront hardships, but we will get the job done." So this is we, direct representation, I am you, we together, we will face challenge, we will face enemies and hardships. Trust me, meaning I am you, and thus you have to be connected with me through faith. Never trust alone, but faith, it means that the unity between the people and its leader doesn't need to be proved, doesn't need to be checked, doesn't need accountability. So the victory of populism is not merely a victory of the people, it's the victory of the true and the right people. Populism in power seems to make possible a kind of what Finkelstein defines the post-fascist coupled with elections, meaning is a kind of radical or strong majoritarianism that even if it doesn't put any adversaries into a silence by putting them outside of the law or repressing them, however, the use of the language against those who are on the wrong side is something crucial also to populism, which is a kind of embodiment, as I said, of the people and the leader. And I quote from Trump again: "It belongs to everyone gathered here today and everyone watching all across America. This is your day. Your day. This is your celebration." He's talking to the American people. And this, the United States of America, is your country. What truly matters is not which party controls our government, not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. So we are back again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be not forgotten any longer, because it's not a government of a party, but a government of the people. Finally, in a classical Carl Schmitt acclamation of his leader as one with his people beyond election, and elections are simply a method for revealing what is already there. Elections don't create the majority. Elections gives the proof and evidence that majority, the good one, is already there and is not corrupted. So Trump again, and I'm going to on the conclusion here. It's a long quote, but is crucial in my view, because it is like an evidence that populism is the same wherever you see it. Everywhere, every 4 years, we gather on these steps to carry out the orderly and peaceful transfer of power, and we are grateful to President Obama and the First Lady Michelle Obama for their gracious aid throughout this transition. They've been magnificent. Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning, because today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we transfer power from Washington, D.C. and giving back to the people. So this is not a majority like any other majority. This, in fact, is not a majority. It is the real people coming back to power. So giving back the power to people, or making again politics as a politics of people, is not the majority among others, is not one transition among others. If this is the case, and I conclude, then the experience of January the 6th with the assault on the Capitol, it was in some sense already contained in the inaugural address of the 2017. Because not all victories are the same, not all majorities are the same, and thus why should why should a populist party or a populist majority accept that his majority is no longer after an election is lost? In my view, thus, the risk of populist in power is contained in the essentialism of his procedure, of the procedure. It's essentialism in the using and managing procedures is the risk of populism, of transforming an election into something that is not simply an election, but is the celebration of the right people through his leader, and the celebration of the only legitimate people. Thus, the risk of populism is to be a borderline phenomenon. And of course, in the case of Trump, calling his people and indicating the Capitol as a place that has been robbed, that has been taken away by declaring a victory that he did not recognize, this is already a step outside democracy. This is already a step in a regime that is a different one. So I would say thus that although we may criticize the American Constitution, although we may criticize the failure of some of its forms of electoral system, it is clear that who won the day who won the case on the 6th of January was precisely the institutional system, which was capable of containing the phenomenon of reification of institutions by one majority declaring to be the only legitimate majority. So in some sense, although weak, it's the American Constitution. Not weak, for me it's not at all weak. According to some critics, may have forms of anti-democratic characteristics, or being somehow in need of some reform. I don't know, I'm not an expert, but certainly in the case of Trump, it was capable of containing the borderline majority defined by we, the right people, by Trump. So in some sense, I'd like simply to conclude here, and I have nothing to say, but to finish and to add by saying that all populist leaders in power, they replicate the same process. And for us, thus, the most difficult moment is to recognize, to understand how populism ends, and whether populists who are in power can go back to the opposition without damaging the institutions or without overturning the constitutional regime to transforming in something in another form of regime. This didn't happen in the States. It was very close to happen, and it showed that to accept election is what is, in my view, the threshold between a democracy or something that is no longer democratic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Urbinati, Nadia. It has been extremely rich and interesting. And now I would give the floor to Professor Scheuermann for comment or further rumination, so to say, about populism and US politics.
So thank you very much, Professor Latorta. Thank you very much, Professor Galberg, and thank you, Nadia, of course, for this wonderful lecture. I guess I just want, there's a lot we can talk about, right? So just two points. One is a conceptual point, but I think potentially it's of use to our discussion. So at the very beginning of your presentation, you want to sharply delineate populism from authoritarianism, at least when it's in power, and clearly from fascism. So that's crucial to the argument. At the same time, my sense is you have continually undermined that sharp distinction in your analysis, right? So one of the things you say is fascism is different because fascists, they embrace violence and they get rid of free elections. And then you said, well, on January 6th, we saw a bit of that. We certainly did, right? So at the very least, January 6th, it seems to me, blurs that distinction, right? So it's true the fascists did this much more efficiently, effectively. They were much more sweeping in getting rid of elections, but then the distinction becomes more or less, it becomes a quantitative one, right? And indeed, you define populism, right, as the authoritarian disfigurement of democracy. It's sort of, it takes us to the edge of democracy, but doesn't quite get us there. I mean, so I just, my sense is what you want to do, what you're doing is you're relying on these ideal types to capture phenomenon that are dynamic, right? So there's a sort of dynamic to some forms of populism, which I think would potentially open the door to something far worse. By the way, Carl Schmitt understood this. He goes from being, I would say, a presidentialist, authoritarian populist to a fascist, right? And there's a logic to that move. It's not necessary, but there's a logic. So I'm wondering if you with your ideal types, if that really helps us, understand these dynamic political processes, right? I mean, maybe these concepts, we should see them as overlapping concepts. You know, Wittgenstein, there are family resemblances. It's a messier story here. Now, I'm not sure we disagree, but I do think I'm less confident than I think you are that we can cleanly delineate these things in the way you want to, even though I think, of course, conceptually that makes sense. So that's the first conceptual point. Second point, I think maybe this is the more interesting political issue. So, you know, you're focusing and you're talking, I think, again, you're right to do this, on Trumpism as part of a general phenomenon, right? As this worldwide, you know, populism, and not just, you know, it's also across time, right? Many different forms, but basically he's a populist. And you will not be surprised to hear this, given our previous conversation in Massimo's seminar. I worry that this analysis does downplay some specific and perhaps unusual traits of the American system, which made the American system prone to Trumpism. I'm also less, I don't know if optimistic is the right word. I think things could have gone, I can't say, as I think you just said, well, January 6th, things worked out okay. I think there was so much contingency at work there. Things could have gone very differently. The outcome could have become much more ominous. And I think the reason for this is that there are some specific traits to the US system which make the US susceptible to populism. So most importantly, and I think this fits quite nicely with your analysis, I mean, you offered this wonderful discussion of the populist view of executive power, right? A kind of extreme plebiscitarianism, a direct relationship, you know, and there's no question that presidential regimes, right? And the US is a presidential regime, and it's an odd presidential regime. And there aren't too many presidential regimes, at least in developed democracies like the US one. I mean, there's no question in my mind, this allowed for something like Trump in a way which may not be the case in non-presidential regimes, right? You know, so populism also in general, I mean, you say this in the paper that I read that your comments were based on. I mean, populists are impatient with constitutionalism, they're impatient with the separation of powers. But in the US case, the unusual, exceptional, and I would say anti-democratic aspects of our constitutional order aided and abetted Trump repeatedly on a regular basis, right? So the Electoral College is how he gained power. The fact that we have the Electoral College is almost how he took power again. The Senate was his political base. I mean, there are these elements of the specific US constitutional system. Now, you haven't denied that there are specific traits, right, to any different system, which are going to be important for the story. But it seems to me, I think we have to weigh them much more than you want to. And the reason I think you don't want to is really what you said at the end of your presentation, that, you know, things basically worked out okay. I mean, I hope you're right about that. I'm a little bit less optimistic about this, and I'm less optimistic because I do think, given the quirky constitutional system which the US has, a leftover from the 18th century, our Model T version with all of its anti-democratic elements, it's not an accident that the US seems prone to a specific form of populism, namely authoritarian right-wing populism. Okay, let me stop there. Nadia, a wonderful lecture. I wish we could do this in person. Very much.
May I answer? I'm supposed to answer or no?
Well, I would prefer to give the floor to the other commentator, and then you can answer collectively. I think it's much better. Bill, thank you very much for your intervention. And then I will have the pleasure to give the floor to Professor Müllerson. Rain, please.
Thank you, Massimo. Thank you, and I thank Professor Urbinati for this interesting presentation. And though I have read your books and articles, in your presentation, today's presentation, there was something which led me to think about things I hadn't thought before. For example, your presentation reminded me the dispute between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey at the beginning of the 20th century. So it was Lippmann as an elitist, and Dewey as a populist or Democrat, and their discussion is quite similar maybe to today's problems, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, in other liberal democracies. And the second point is that when you spoke about stabilization of liberal democracies in the 1960s, these were the period of what the French called the glorious 30 years. But this stabilization, yes, I believe, and this is related to the current wave of globalization, this may be not only stabilization, but stagnation also. So, and I'll come back to this, and probably these problems in the US and in Europe are also that this glorious period of liberal democracy, it is more or less over, because liberal democracy is not only stable, but this is a period of stagnation also here. I am not going to say anything about the democracy in the United States, because I am not American. I am not a specialist on the US political system. So therefore, I would like to make some other different comments which relate to issues of democracy in various liberal democracies. It was in 2007 and 2008, I gave lectures in the Hague Academy of International Law on promotion of democracy, because I had worked in the middle of the 2000s as the UN representative to Central Asia, and one of my tasks was to promote democracy in that part of the world, which I tried to do, but probably not very successfully. And therefore, the Hague Academy, the curatorium, asked me to speak about democracy, promotion of democracy, specifically in that part of the world. But I made my presentation, my lectures more theoretical, and I spoke about dialectical contradictions or relations which democracy has with other related phenomena. It was, first of all, democracy and nationalism, then democracy and capitalism, or democracy and market economy, and democracy and liberalism. Why they have dialectical relationships? I mean that on the one hand, these phenomena support each other, but on the other hand, also they limit or even undermine their respective counterparts. For example, today democracy is taken by many as something what Americans, I believe, call mostly godmotherhood and apple pie. Nothing wrong, nothing can be said against these phenomena. While nationalism is almost absolute evil. And you have been like one Yoram Hazony, I don't know whether you have familiar with his book, The Virtue of Nationalism, in order to say something good about nationalism. But we have forgotten probably that these two phenomena, democracy in the contemporary world and nationalism, they are genetically related. They emerged at the same time, and nationalism meaning that ethnicities, they had the right to have their nation state, and democracy flourished, emerged and flourished within nation states. Now, because of various reasons, and mainly because of, let's say, negative side effects of globalization, the nation state has been undermined. Probably you know that in the 1990s and at the beginning of the 2000s, there were several books and many articles devoted to the demise of states, or demise of the nation state. But there is no democracy, at least so far. I don't know democracy beyond nation states. There's no democracy in international relations. So therefore, of course, today nationalism, which then was directed against the feudal fragmentation of European political systems on the one hand, and on the other hand against empires. So freedom from these imperial or foreign rule. So these times are today over, and therefore, of course, nationalism plays mostly negative role. But at the same time, this positive aspect of nationalism is still there. And we can see in Europe many states, or let's say people within these states, they try to curb the power of Brussels and to take power back to these nation states. And I even such a president who is such an overt Europhile like President Macron, I don't think that he would, let's say, give the veto power of France to the European Union. Therefore, the role of nation states is, in my opinion, now increasing, and therefore, this is one of the reasons why democracy has been undermined, not only in the United States of America, even probably less there, but more in smaller European countries, because democracy genetically and otherwise has been part of nation states. It's I would say the nation state is a cradle of democracy. Democracy doesn't can hardly exist without them. So globalization undermining statehood is also undermining democracy. I said less probably in the United States, because the US as a powerful country can be more independent vis-a-vis negative effects of globalization than smaller states. But of course, the US may have other problems. Are they really the people of the US who decides, or are they not only political elites, military industrial complex, bankers and GAFAs, these Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, who decide at the end of the day. Now, in Europe, I would say Europe, and here we see mostly what may be called contradiction between democracy and liberalism. I would like to quote from a French philosopher, Chantal Delsol, who recently wrote, and I tend to agree with her, that, I quote, "The populists, contrary to what some may say, are really Democrats." I believe Professor Urbinati also may agree with that. Then, but I am continuing to quote. But they are not liberals, so populist. At the same time, universal elites like those in Brussels are really liberals who are not any more Democrats, since they don't like when people vote to limit some liberties. And here I see the crisis of democracy in the European Union, when globalization probably, or let's say hyper-globalization as it is sometimes called, may be liberal. I don't think that globalization can be democratic. And today even let's see those governments which are freely and fairly elected. So, and therefore they are democratic governments. They cannot carry through those mandates which they are given by their electorate, because they are not able to do that, especially if we take the economic matters. Now we see that pandemics has gone from outside of these countries, and they face problems which are not of their own making. So it means that, yes, formally, and maybe even in a way, really, most European countries are democratic countries, but they are not able to fulfill promises what they give to their electorate. And today, these are not imperial ambitions of some centers of power, though they also exist, but what I would call the invisible hand of global markets, as well as global problems, environmental and sanitary and so on. And also what we see, it is not only economic liberalism or excesses of it, which are undermining democracy, but it is also social liberalism or also excesses of it. Because for democracy to exist and to flourish, there should be some common values, common understandings, what is good and what is bad in society. And liberalism that is related to individualism is undermining social bonds necessary for democracy to flourish. Finally, democracy is a form of political organization and functioning of society. And it doesn't belong to this trinity I mentioned before of God, motherhood, and apple pie. It is acceptable as far as it delivers, though, of course, there is some intrinsic value in democracy as well. There are other factors, in my opinion, that are equally or even more important than democracy today. It is good governance and resilience, or the capacity of societies or governments of states to adapt quickly to new challenges. And really, the EU is not doing very well, to put it mildly, in that respect. It is not clear how the US will come out of the current crisis, but it seems to me that by electing Joe Biden, the American political elite has kicked the can farther down the road instead of taking the bull by the horns. And unfortunately, though all analogies are deficient, of course, this reminds me in some respects only, of course, the 1984 in the former Soviet Union, when the gerontocracy of the Soviet Politburo couldn't do any better than picking aging Konstantin Chernenko as the safe pair of hands as the leader of the Soviet Union. And of course, it paved the way later to Gorbachev, coming to Gorbachev and reforms of perestroika and glasnost. So I hoped that the 4 years of Trumpism in the United States would have shaken the society in such a way that they could come up with something better. Because I believe now this is going back to what existed before Trump was elected in 2016. Though there are, mostly not only Joe Biden, but also other people around who are all familiar faces from previous democratic administrations. So though there are some new faces, of course, the vice president, first of all, is new. And yesterday I read in the Figaro an interesting article about a young lady who is now taking on the GAFAs. And so there are some encouraging changes, in my opinion, also. But mostly, I believe Trump didn't shake enough the US society in order they would have come up with something better. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Rain. So I understand you have preferred for Trump to be in charge 4 years more, to shake America more, yeah? I understand,
yes, but,
I understand your point, but I'm not sure that, you know, if you shake too strong, you can break the tree. If you shake a tree a bit too strong, you can break the tree.
That's
so
true.
I would say let's keep the tree alive. Let's keep the tree alive.
I agree with you, but I believe the US is not that former Soviet Union. Of course, it is not going to collapse. That's for sure. So.
Allow me to remind you. I'm sorry. I'm the chairman. I should be neutral, but you know, in a sense, I'm abusing of my office, so to say. That Switzerland is a democracy and it's not a nation state. Czechoslovakia was a great democracy. It was, and during the 2 wars, the First and the Second World War, actually it was the only democracy in Eastern Europe for many years. It was not a nation state. So
I mean nation state as a state.
It's a state. It is still possible to have democracies that are not based on the nation state.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
All right. So I'm now. Thank you very much. In any case, yeah. Thank you. It's very, very challenging and what you say. And then I would give the floor to Professor Lisa Past, which is our third commentator. Please. Professor Past, you are there?
I am here indeed,
Please,
and I hope you can hear me. And thank you, professors. Whilst in this honorable company, I'm adding the observations of a mere applied democracy activist and defender of the infrastructure that's underlying democracy. I've always made a different choice than a PhD, since it's appeared to me that there's some more exciting things going on in real life, which of course is not true. And Professor Urbinati, I particularly appreciated your view of populism as fundamentally constructivist. And I think there's something very liberating about that, since a tool in the current toolbox of both sides of the political conversation is the view of the truth and the imperative that brings. And once I get to the remarks of where to go or what to do as a hands-on activist, I'll pursue that line of reasoning a little more. But I think it's both a useful and timely reminder. And it is indeed what a time where the return of the boring and professional governance becomes an event in itself indeed to react to, as we've already seen in this conversation. So what I'll do is I'll offer a handful of reactions and thoughts in a semi-structured way, and then another handful sort of action items or things to do, so that we think about the role of governments and societies, but also public intellectuals and academia in not admiring the problem, but in turning the tide a little, perhaps. So in the observations, as a risk manager, I've starting perhaps about 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, I spent 2018 and 19 in the States on a fellowship, started to worry about what January 20th would look like, January 20th, 2021. And very clearly in my mind's eye foresaw, peasants with pitchforks on the streets of Washington, D.C. My friends in the academia, as well as my friends in governance, including the national security apparatus of the United States, laughed me and sometimes in a somewhat patronizing way offered me a seat and a glass of sugary water. They were completely off. I was off by 2 weeks. So there is definitely an issue that those who should serve as the early warning and those who are there to protect the basic infrastructure of democracy and rule of law did not see the paramilitary bubbles where populism and fascism overlap, operationalize themselves to the extent that they were on the street indeed. Then secondly, I think there's an interesting dichotomy that perhaps you can address in your reactions to the reactions of populism as a reactionary or not a reactionary phenomena. And you highlighted that populism is not a reaction to democracy, but I would argue that populism by its very nature is a reaction to something. Populism is reactionary. It's the us versus them needs a them. It needs a push. It needs something to vilify. It needs something to be not of the people. It needs the corrupt elite or whatever else it is. And if it's not a reaction to democracy, and I would argue that it's not, I would agree with that. I would argue that it's a reaction to the lack of sense of empowerment or the the need for empowerment of the empowered, unempowered rather. So those perceiving the perceived loss of perceived status and blaming liberal democracy or elitism for that. And, you know, let's be blunt, and as a non-academic here, I can afford that. It is a reaction, this populism is a reaction to a great degree to the fact that those who are not white men in the US political system have access to resources, attention, and decision-making, as well as public discussion. And by the mere demographic fortune of being born a white man that gave you a certain standing a century or even half a century ago, you're no longer of a certain status. The working class man can no longer afford the picket fence that they were able just a couple generations ago. So I would argue it's a reaction to that. And it's definitely that societies of certain makeup are certainly more prone to populism in that reactionary way, particularly highlighted by the definition of populism you gave. And then that makes me circle back to this liberating idea of populism itself being a construct in a post-constructivist, post-modernist, or at least constructivist society. And I think it's also what feeds this populism is that constructivism, the idea that there might not be an objective truth when it comes to matters of identity, that identity itself is not determined by blood, but by construct, it's harder to accept cognitively and as a society in public discussion. The more populists they're out there because it threatens the very sort of monopoly of truth that the populist seeks. And it also threatens the strong, strict inclusionary, exclusionary identity that you mentioned. So from these observations, let me offer a few ideas of where to go with this or what to do. And particularly those listening here who are considering different, once you're angry, what do you do? I think there's a lot to be done as intellectuals, public intellectuals and activists. And this, of course, assumes that the cleavages in society that are real and true and that become canyons easily in the hands of populists, that these are not constructive and nor normal in a democracy. I think we share that belief here. First of all, in the US context, Professor Müllerson spoke about taking stock of the European ideals of democracy. I think the US idea of constitutional institutions needs to be reviewed. And, it did not work out okay. There's nothing okay about marauding in the holiest of the holy halls of democracy, in the halls of Congress. And fundamentally, the US Constitution was drafted by gentlemen for statesmen. And Trump is neither of those things. And this system by gentlemen for statesmen is fundamentally incapable of handling someone who's neither of those things. The institutions, the setup doesn't handle populism because it handles deliberative democracy and writing, the founding fathers writing Federalist Papers. So what happened was that those in the power to change something, including the American institutionalized conservatives, the ambassadors, the generals, the senior civil servants, retreated into the illusion that institutions are strong, that the wheels keep on turning of the institutions without them needing to do anything. And that's escapism to the extreme. The wheels of the US democracy only keep on turning if gentlemen and statesmen, and in this context, it's not the gender term, keep on pushing the cart that the wheel's attached to. So that's for one. I think there's institutional, constitutional reform, or at least reconsideration needing. Secondly, Professor Urbinati saw it coming and I saw it coming, but apparently it took a particular kind of female institution, I would say, or intuition rather, based on this anecdotal evidence of two women in this conversation, to see it coming. The early warning mechanism that would allow for course correction when, again, the underlying principles of democracy, of constitutional democracy are being threatened is needed, and the early warning mechanism needs to be better. It's a failure of those whose job it is to protect peaceful democracies. And maybe it's that maybe we need to accept populism and get out of our ivory towers and accept that the likes of us are in a minority who at 6:30 on a school day evening whilst it's sunny outside in Tallinn, which happens once in a blue moon, if even then, are discussing it. It's only 51 of us here today. So maybe we're no longer the critical mass, and we have to get off our high horse and accept that we're not the people, and whoever died and gave us the right to be prescriptive or imperative. But I'm not quite eating that dog food myself. So I think there is a lot to do to empower the citizenry, but not in this sort of from the ivory tower way, but rather in very specific ways of civic education. The first of them is to educate on the workings of governance, and in particularly the relevance and mechanisms of elections, so that the idea of elections being a mechanism or a way to steal power doesn't gain a footing. And I think this empowerment of the unempowered actually starts with a better understanding of the mechanisms and values and the social contract idea of democratic governance and rule of law. Since whatever the democratic governance is, from Estonia to Switzerland that was mentioned, to the US in a federal system, any democracy involves some level of delegation of trust and decision making. And those mechanisms have to be understood, and the citizens have to be educated on them so that trust is restored or placed in those mechanisms. And also in this empowerment, I think the American public intellectual has gotten lost somewhere. And that is a role that, the likes of those in these conversations, and there's some true intellectual giants here, have to reclaim themselves by force. The public intellectual now is, the pundits and newspaper columnists. The best of those are the likes of David Brooks or Rachel Maddow. But who tend to really be the public intellectual now is the late night comedic TV show host. And then also, if I had to name an academic American who's a public intellectual, it's perhaps Tim Snyder, Professor Timothy Snyder, who ironically writes mostly on populism and nationalism by now. And I'll to get to all of this, and it's a lot of little ideas, I know. I think another aspect in which the US system needs to be rethought is as a reform of its institutionalized level of solidarity, whether it comes to access to education, healthcare, or anything else. The US is one of the very few developed, wealthy nations in the world where being reasonably alive and reasonably literate is not a human right, and that basically makes it a really expensive and division driving system that I can't see being sustainable. So with these observations and a lot of action items, I'm returning to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fast. It's very interesting comments. Now I would ask Professor Urbinati to react, to reply.
Well, I would need 2 hours conversation here because it's a huge amount of interesting observations and inputs. Well, I'll start with Bill. 2 main points he made. The first one, family resemblance with fascism. Yes, I agree with that. And I wrote elsewhere also in the book using precisely Wittgenstein on this family resemblance. So you cannot make a straightforward separation between one regime and another one, simply because in the dynamic, one passed through the other one in a moment or through phenomena that are political somehow. So you need to explain the similarity. And indeed, in some sense, fascism has similarities with democracy. It's not completely outside, because it's based on consent. Of course, it's a consent without dissent, because it's based on representation of the people, although it is made according to an intolerant and homogeneous vision. So it keeps going on with these strategies that seem close to democracy, but they are not, in fact, at the end. Indeed, the founders of fascism in Italy, at least Mussolini, the first speech he gave in the parliament in 22 was to separate itself from democracy, liberalism, and socialism. That is to show the difference. And against liberalism, he proposed ethical state. Against democracy, he proposed corporate unification and not individual law electors. And against socialism, he proposed the nation state, or the nation unity of interest versus classism. So yes, there are similarities and dissimilarities. This, we are totally on the same track. Concerning the case of American problems of deficiencies in terms of democracy in these constitutions, I think that this is a project that could be very interesting. We tend to identify in our even in our teaching sometimes, democracy and republicanism, but they're not the same. We tend to overlap the two, and democracy was supposed since the beginning to have only one collective demos made of equals, even if they were inside, there were inside some oligarchs inside, but from the point of view of the equal right to say in the assembly, or the equal right to vote, were all of them identical in one collective and one sovereign. The Republican proposal was different from that. They split the sovereign into two, and they put this dialectic between the few and the many as part of the game. There are different ways of interpreting this dualism, one in the more harmonious based one, à Aristotle, the other one, à Machiavelli, more conflictual one, but simply there is a duality here, not a unity. And according to me, the American model is Republican more than Democrat, because it's based on this dialectic. Although it is a dialectic constructed according to institutional, the rule of law, some legal equality and political equality in terms of one right, one vote, but the logic of the institutions is a Republican logic. It's more than a democratic logic. I do agree. I think that you are completely right, and I agree with you. Now, there is, you say, okay, fine. There are some similarities that they are based similar to all populists, yet in the American case, there is some specificity. In all forms of populism, there is specificity, not only the American case. there is this impatience with institutions. This is part of all the discourse of populism. Wherever you are, they tend to rewrite the constitution where they can. Think there are cases in Venezuela or in Hungary. They rewrite the constitution to reassert the power of a dead majority. So it is as if a majority constitutionalizes itself within the constitution. So yes, there are similarities and dissimilarities. There is this impatience with the institutional separation for institutional checks and limitation of power coming from outside the political realm of opinion, of will formation, of opinion will formation. Fine, I agree with that. However, it seems to me that we have to accept the fact that no system, not even the most perfect one, can be completely immunized. And to look for full immunity is very dangerous. To look for full immunization by eliminating all the risk is terrible. I mean, it is exactly what fascists wanted to do, to eliminate the possibility of a risk in terms of opposition. So I don't know where the American is going and what kind of future the American will have, but we cannot avoid that. And by the way, I really don't even think that democracy is something we can praise only when it gives us good things. Democracy can give us also decisions that we don't like. It can give us precedent we don't like. It can give us majorities we don't like. And this part is the game. For me, I come from Bobby's tradition, and this idea of dialectic and conflict and plurality and pluralism inside is fundamental, because it's not static and not even necessarily from the point of view of democracy something that is without negativity. It's within itself the negativity. But you are completely right when you say that we have to be attentive to the institutional order. A presidential system is more exposed. I agree with you. A presidential system is more exposed to have a plebiscitary leadership and to use election as a celebration of that presidential leadership in a Kashmir sense, in some sense, more collective, less individualistic. And in this way, why Schmidt was an anti-parliamentarian. After all, he criticized parliamentarianism precisely because he wanted to have the unification of the people under the leader. And thus, the parliament is, in some sense, the parliamentary system, the best medicine against that kind of parliamentary, presidentialist form of populist. Although you can have also in today's democracy or today parliamentary democracy, you can have populist movements, but this is more complicated to create a strong populist majority in a parliamentary system. When you can do so, though, like in Venezuela with Chavez or like in Hungary, well, if you have a large majority, you can change the constitution and transform your majority into a constitutionalized one. The risk is always there. You cannot afford. But you are right. A presidential system is more exposed, particularly if it is elected by the people. Then I ask you, well, if it is the direct election of the president an issue, why you are so against indirect election by the college? You know? It's a way of limiting or containing the plebiscitarianism that would be otherwise, you know, huge. This is an open question. I don't know what the founding fathers had in mind when they proposed this idea. They knew that there was this kind of Caesarism implied in that system, and perhaps they wanted to have another step, an intermediation in order to block the direct relationship between them and the people institutionally at the institutional level. But then with the new media, you can create a plebiscitary by other means, that is through the public. From Wilson on, all the presidents, particularly some of them, they tended to have a direct relation with the people by passing the mediation of the institutions to relate to the people. Thus, although the institutions put some limits, and you say that those limits are though anti-democratic, perhaps you're right, they can, outside of the institutions, find a way of overcoming those limits by this democracy of the public as we have today. And this is highly difficult for me to overcome. Now, concerning Rain, well, the topics are different. I'd like to select some of them. First of all, the question of the nation and democracy. Yes, contemporary democracies are all of them based on the nation more than the people. In Europe, in particular, in the States is different, but the nation a la CS. Fine. The nation, though, and this is what the articulation of political parties aim at, the nation can be articulated in a pluralistic way. So what you have to do is indeed to break the unity of the people and make it into articulation internally through different ideologies, parties. For me, party democracy in a parliamentary system is the way to contain and limit the possibility of these populistic moments. So the question is not to overcome nationalism. And the populists, they transform the nationalist cause into a quasi holistic way of unification, which is never united. Even nations are plural inside. Even one nation speaking the same language is made of different groups. I come from a country in which we have a language, we have plenty of dialects and and there is a huge plurality. So it's very hard to mold one nation into a unity that has no internal divisions. And thus, in this sense, democracy is a way of exploding the division, because democracy implies opposition, majority opposition, opposition and majority. It is a dialectic between opposition and majority, and thus it develops pluralism, cannot live in a unanimity domain. Democracy is not unanimity. So to be based on a nation doesn't mean that you have to have holistic conception of the nation. This is a complicated, I understand very well, but there are different conceptions of nations, different conception of nationalism, some political and some more ethnical. And I would say that on this distinction we need to insist. Recently, Yael Tamir wrote another second book on the nation. What is the nation? And she also made this argument concerning different conceptions of nations and nationalism. Well, that takes me to another contradiction you expressed between liberalism and democracy. Here, we would need to have a long conversation, longer than I can. Kelsen used to say that there are different conceptions, different ways of interpreting liberalism. There is economic liberalism, there is the liberalism of civil rights or cultural of the like the moral self. So there are different conceptions again. It's not simply liberalism a la neoliberal economy, and it's not even the question of individualism is open to democracy, because democracy is based on one head, one vote. Even in Athens, you have this idea of the individuals going one by one in voting. So there is an element of individualism also in democracy. It's not a democracy, it's not mass democracy a la Kashmir. It's a democracy based by the opinion of each individual, counting votes one by one. Why we count votes one by one? Because we respect the individual perspective or the individual preferences. So individualism is thus inside of democracy. And what about liberty and democracy, or liberalism and democracy? In a recent book by Joshua Ober concerning, the title is Demopolis, Democracy Before Liberalism. Meaning, of course, if we talk about rights, this is modernity. This has to do with after the medieval time and not before. Fine. But if we talk about liberty and democracy, then of course democracy is an expression of political liberty. You don't create democracy if you don't have the plurality of ideas and the tranquility of expressing those ideas in the public. You really implies that you can express yourself freely, and thus you produce dissent, you produce diversity. This is liberty inside of democracy. So the dualism between liberty and democracy, or liberalism and democracy, that during the Cold War became a kind of quintessential dogma, it is problematic in my view, because today, applying to democracy, applying to populism, I have, in some sense, some objection to Cass Mood on this issue precisely because of that. If we tend to consider liberal / democracy in a separate way, so that liberalism is freedom, the place of freedom, democracy is the place of power of the people, then if we rob democracy of freedom, we end up by saying, well, populism occupies the space of democracy and is against liberalism, but is not against democracy. I totally disagree with that. This is the argument that also gives birth to the idea that democracy, or populism and democracy, are in the same, after all, the same thing. Simply, democracy is a more populism is more extreme democracy. What is against, truly is against liberalism, but it's not against democracy. I have some resistance with that. First, because it is an impoverished view of democracy. Democracy is not simply the power of the people, or the power of the so-called sovereign people, but it is a power of the people constructed, made through an articulation of ideas in the public, and thus pluralism, and thus conflict, and thus freedom. You don't have democracy if you don't have an opposition. You don't have democracy if you don't have contested elections, and so on and so forth. So in some sense, democracy is political freedom. And if it is political freedom, some forms of liberties that liberalism vindicates only for itself are there. For me, this is crucial. So we need really, when we speak about populism, we imply a conception of democracy. And in my conception of democracy, liberty belongs to democracy, not to outside of democracy. Otherwise, everything can be democracy. Even a fascist can be a democracy, or a radical populist can be democracy. So we have to be, in this case, very cautious. Second issue has to do with what to do, how to exit populism, and the question of the US now. And this allows me also to say something about Europe. Compare Europe and the US as two ways of proposing exit from populism. Now, the way in which Europe has, I see in my country, but I see also in Macron, I see also in Germany, the way in which of blocking populism is by politicized democracy, creating strong techno system, strong managerial, or if you want to say so, governance kind of organization, instead of relying upon conflict between different options or party conflicts. So in the case of Macron, in the case of my country, we have the same people unified, although not under a populist leader, but under a technocratic kind of guidance. So there is a kind of maintenance of the same unity of people without internal socialist or liberal dualism. And this unity of the people is practiced, or it is governed by technocratic approaches, which exclude opposition or excludes partisan interpretation. This is the European way of, and I think it is a way that is very problematic for democracy. The American way, I think that the case I think that Biden is much more than simply another solution to the problem. It is an important way of dealing with it. First, it reclaimed a social interpretation of democracy versus an anti-social and hyper-individualistic interpretation. Second, it reclaimed the state intervention not only as a way of exiting from COVID and the pandemics, but also as a way of solving problem of huge inequalities, social, political, and gender, or even minority in the population. So that is a social democratic solution to the problem of populism. And this allows me to say that Habermas years ago said that populism wins because social democracy doesn't do its job. And I think he was right. And thus there are two ways of answering populism. A technocratic one, deflating politics, deflating conflict, and opposite, inflating politics and conflicting one project versus another one. So the Democrats are doing the good job in this way because they are reclaiming the partisan dualism that democracy is about. So it's not by deflating politics, but giving back politics is due. And I think this is an important way of curing, an important medicine of curing society from Trumpism. If they succeed, if the Trump administration succeed in this, and perhaps with the COVID and the justification of injecting money in order to solve the issue of the pandemics, it can succeed, then we may have a real way of an alternative, a going out of populism as a model. This is a model to going out of populism. In Europe, we don't go out of populism. It's a kind that we metabolize populism by transforming it into a technocratic solution. So we take away the antipathetic rhetoric, and we inject in it the rhetoric of cost and benefits, or as Draghi would say in my country, go to the input and output and you solve the problem with the validation of all the outcomes, and then outcome judge, analyze according to parameter or criteria that are not political. So fine. And they say this is the good of the people, of all the people, not one part or another one. So this is techno-populism versus social democracy, I would say. That is my what to do. And I think in this case, the US can give us an important solution. Unfortunately, Europe doesn't listen to these ears, because Europe has been, all the states, educated in the last 20 years to metabolize technocracy, to transform all issues into technocratic issues. Thus, the bad Brussels transfer to each state. And now they're all accepting this logic of the real issue is elimination of political conflicts and to transform it into a technocracy. So this brings me to the last question, Lisa. Yes, I agree with you. Not only constructivism, but antis. Populism is a system of antis. How many antis you find in populism? Anti-intellectualism, anti-establishment, anti-classist, as you say, anti-immigrants, it is a construction of a unity by negative, in the negative, by creating the enemies. And the enemies are needed. They don't eliminate the enemy. It's never the overcome a la Schmitt. We overcome the enmity by reconstructing. No, they need the enmity, because thanks to them, they can say, this is the conspiracy argument, they can say there is always our enemy, and this is the way in we nourish ourselves. So the anti is a way of nourishing the justification for existing. And this is a form of constructivism, without assuming that there is a the truth against the non-truth. Here we are navigating in the domain of constructing of politics, strategies, and vision. So in some sense, we should think outside of the epistemic approach, those who are right and those who are wrong. But certainly those are some are more effective than others. So constructivism has to do with the creation of a representative people. So populism competes with democracy, with party democracy, with pluralist democracy, in the way of constructing the people. And the construction of the people with antis, instead of constructing the people with internal pluralism, and it is thus a fight over the representation of the people. This is what populism is about. Now, you say something important concerning, I like you when you say, you know, be careful, because in attacking a rebellion, rejecting populism, we may end up by being like in an ivory tower, the superior and the inferior. We are, you know, on the right side, and those plebeians and populists are on the right side because they are inferior, because they are ignorant, because there is this tendency in our society, in our democracy, particularly in Europe, I have to say, there is this plebeianization of the people, and the assumption that the competent should rule and those who know more should have the last say. There is thus an attempt to, in my view, for myself, to avoid, never identify populism with the people, and thus never criticize populism and the people together. They are two different things, and we don't want to throw the baby along with the water when we criticize populism. And thus, what to do? You said, well, perhaps constitutional reforms. I'm not an expert on that. I don't know what to do. I simply know, for experience, practical and political experience, because I was involved in this politics, every time there is an attempt to change the constitution is a dangerous time, at least in my country, because it's a way of solving through the basic rules problems that are political. And that is a sense of weakness sometimes of politics, when instead of the debating among themselves, they enter into and they construct the solution, the institutional, constitutional. But each country has its own story. I cannot know. Civic education, yes, but civic education also has to do with channels of participation. Meaning, Mill used to say that the making is the school of sentiment. Doing is a school of sentiment. Meaning, we have to empower citizenship by creating more avenues for people's voice. There are parts of the population that are totally unheard. There are parts of the population, they don't have representation. They don't have a voice on their side. So the question of representative democracy is a real problem question, because it has to do with an inefficient way of giving voice to people, to all of them, not only the majority, and not only those who can afford to give money to parties, and thus also to be stronger when they have to share in representation. So yes, Bill, it's true, Biden has tried the Catholic, but Catholics and Bill and Sherman and Biden press is a Catholic in America. Catholics, they tend to,
though. I'm
sorry, they tend to avoid conflict, and they don't like it. He does instead. I was shocked because I thought it was more moderate. Instead, he's a fighter, and he doesn't have problems with the conflict. He has less problems than Obama, who was afraid of disagreements. He doesn't, he's an old guard. Sometimes we need to go to old guard people who know they were experienced in contestation and opposition. It is as if, parentheses, the long tradition of the liberationists we come from it inoculates inside of us the antivirus of conflict. We don't like conflict. We want to have connection, consent. This kind of hyper-deliberativist, it's something that is not so necessarily good. We need to accept the idea that there are partisans and different opinions concerning parties. So civic education is also an education to plurality of position. As a Democrat, I know that I have many differences with other interpretations of democracy, and I think that this is a civic expression of disagreements that is fundamental, is a part of democracy, which is not unanimity, as I said, but pluralism. And then the question of maintenance of our institutions. That is a huge issue also that would require much more than few words, that I'm not capable of giving you more than that today. But I think that party conflicts, transforming rage into a process of will formation through associations and as parties, crucial. Crucial, because today we don't have, in many democracies, people have no way of translating rage and emotions into political projects. This is what parties should do. So civic education or maintenance of institutions, transforming rage through civic education, but also party affiliation are, for me, important answer to you. Perhaps I didn't answer to nobody. I don't know. I saw a question by Rain. I'm not sure about the perspective of social. I'm not about the social. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. No. I think I would like to ask also Bill to say so. In the US, it's very strange, very strange. They were traditionally so anti-socialist, that now they are no longer afraid. Perhaps because there is no longer the Soviet Union. It's over, the enemy is over outside, out there. And the China is not socialist. China is rampant capitalism. Fine. It is as if there is more freedom to say openly some words and some project that there was not there before. I don't know why, but it's possible to have social democracy expressly said there, then here in Europe, which the word left or socialist is something disliked almost. So I think it's very strange, the situation in the States. They can be more radically involved into politics than we are in Europe. And in some sense, what can I say? It is wrong, in my view, to identify the social democratic project with populism. Please give ideas their due. Social democracy and the social states is an idea of democracy. It's not populism. No. And thus, we would like that this is true. I would like to see in the States the renaissance of party democracy, because it's the only strategy against populism. We don't have many strategies after all. Either technocracy by moderating, taming the populists, but this is not a way, because it's a way of eliminating politics, or by going back to democratic party democracy. So that is my question, my answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I don't know, it's a bit late. We have been having this seminar already 2 hours. I think we can perhaps allow ourselves 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If there is any question from the audience, they can chat. They can put the question on the chat, and then I will. Is there any question from the audience? Okay, if there is no question of the audience, I would say something. And I must say that I'm not fully satisfied. And I'm not fully satisfied. I think there is something. I think there is something missing in the picture. There is something very important missing in the picture.
Oh, many things are missing.
Yeah, but someone big. The elephant. There is an elephant. We are not. And the elephant, you know, is. Well, there are, I would say, 3 elephants.
Oh my God.
First of all, the first elephant is neoliberalism. And this is neoliberalism is a specific form of capitalism. And I think the populism has a lot to do with neoliberalism. And this, I think, would meet some of a few of Rein Mullerson's worries. Rein Mullerson intervention dealt a lot about globalization and so on and so on, but I think I'm not sure I agree with him about what I share his Weltanschauung, so to say, his worldview. But I think he is right in pointing at this, let's say, triumphant capitalism. So we are living in some kind of, we are back to Dickens' time. So if you take Oliver Twist, and you can translate Oliver Twist, of course, in the situation, historical situation is different. They don't have workhouses. We don't have workhouses, at least not in the Western society and so on. But I would say that the destitute, the desperation, the disintegration of communities in many parts of the world, and also in the West, specifically, I would say, in the United States, think of Detroit, think of Baltimore. And I think that they could still find people like Oliver Twist in Baltimore and in Detroit today. So this is a big elephant. And the other big elephant is the show society. We are speaking, you presented an excellent, thank you very much, and very intelligent consideration, reflection about populism. But, you know, from an angle that could be the angle of the end of 19th century. So in a sense, when you speak of politics, I'm listening Anthony Trollope. You know Anthony Trollope, the Prime Minister, the novel. I'm reading this Palliser, a series of novels by Anthony Trollope. Yeah, the Prime Minister. So this is, but we are in a completely different society. So, and we are in a completely different society because we are in la société du spectacle. We have to do with show, the permanent show, and the screen. So the public sphere is on the screen, We don't have public spaces beyond the screen. This is the reality. And then the third elephant, which is connected with this, is the digital society. So if you don't consider neoliberalism, the digital society, and the show society, la société du spectacle, I don't understand what is populism, what is thing. It's complete. So we need to take into account these 3 big elephants because they determine, I would say, what politics and especially what populism today means and realizes all over the world, I would say.
So, Massimo, in my book on Meet the People, I have the spectacle society or the society of the public and the digital. Two long chapters. But here today I had to talk about a specific case of called Trumpism.
Thank you.
So I cannot do everything in once. But on question of
I understand that.
Question on neoliberalism, which is in any case this would require a different approach because it has to do with the construction of ideology. I think neoliberalism is an ideology connected to a specific economic order and so on and so forth. Fine, I totally agree with you that there are forms of regressive capitalism in terms of job without any rights, forms of deregulation of the job market, something that brings us back to prior socialist party were born in 19th century, mid-19th century. I want to tell you something on that, however. Neoliberalism, and this is a question that I pose to myself. I've never been able to give an answer, so I pose to you, all of you. Now, the connections of neoliberalism and populism. I think that between the two, there is kind of flirtation and love story. Why? Because populism lives out of a disorganized public or the people, in which parties are no longer capable of being rooted inside of the society. And these associated people is a fantastic way of unifying them, like Laclau taught us, unifying them through a leader, that is through a spectacle or a narrative. Now, neoliberalism is a society that disintermediates us and thus makes paradoxically easier for a political leader to mushroom up and to construct through media his own destiny and his own success by unifying claims that are otherwise would be impossible to unify. So there is a correlation. I was talking recently with Mario Tronti, and indeed he posed these problems the same. There is a correlation between populism as the way of unifying peoples that is more in tune with the society that is very intermediated because of neoliberal individualization and this organization. I don't know whether this is simply an ideology or not, but it's a question interesting to explore in some sense.
All right, thank you very much. I think we could stop here. If I don't think I can, please
answer properly to Rain when you question pose the issue of the. It says the contradictory relationship between democracy and capitalism. That is connected, and I think not only you are right, and I agree with you on that. The correlation together of these, the going together of capitalism and democracy seemed easy when there was the Cold War. One of the aspects of the ideology of liberalism in the Cold War is that capitalism is friendly to democracy, but not state socialism. That was the logic. So in some sense, that idea declined along with the decline of the Cold War. It is very hard to say that populism, democracy and populism are the same thing. Certainly, populism can grow up easily in a non-democratic like China as in a democratic state. And what is more dangerous is that it can erode from within the sense of trust in institutions, because on the one hand, democracy presumes that we are all capable of understanding us as equal citizens. Whereas if between our equality as citizens and our inequality as members of society, if this distance is huge or big, then democracy ends up by being not believed by the people. This is a joke. This is a trick. It's no longer what democracy promises us. So there is this inhospitable relationship between capitalism and democracy, particularly now, in my view.
Nadia, thank you very much. I hope we can continue this discussion in person in Tallinn. So you are really warmly invited to come to Tallinn. I don't know, as soon as it is possible to you. Tallinn is, I don't know whether you have been in Tallinn. Tallinn is a wonderful, a beautiful city, beautiful, a charming medieval city, beautiful, and you are warmly welcome, really.
Thank you so much. You know, the paradox we will have as soon as we can go away freely is that we will go around all the time, because you know how many places we say, oh my God, we'll see each other soon. So we are going to be for 1 or 2 or 3 years always around the world.
This is also my plan. Once it is possible to travel, I will start traveling as a madman. So because I want to meet friends again, to hug them, and this is very important. So we would like to have you in person in Tallinn, and in order to also to go on with this discussion, because this is because in 2 hours this discussion cannot be, of course, really the topic is so big, so important. We cannot really believe that we can really deal with it in 2 hours. And I also I have seen that we have in the audience we have scholars, friends that have been involved in populist studies. For instance, there is John Erik Fossum from Arriva and I'm very glad to have John Erik in the audience. So I address him really warm greetings, and I hope that it would be possible to have him too in Tallinn, and also Bill, John Erik, and there was Bart van Klink from Amsterdam, also a specialist on populism. So I think it should be very important for us that you could come, and so you should promise. So give me a promise that you come to Tallinn, please. Promise. Do promise. Okay. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Really
Rain, and Lisa, and Massimo, and Indrek. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perhaps Indrek would say, Indrek, you can say some final words. And
well, yes, it's something is, you know, always very interesting to listen is these kind of discussions where we have very high level academicians are debating on very topical issues and the problems that are happening in the world now. And well, we're definitely continuing, as Massimo said, SOGOLAS School of Governance, Law and Society in Tallinn University and this Global Forum platform is meant to be for these kind of activities. So I truly hope to see you all in our further events that are definitely going to happen, and I hope that this pandemic situation will be over soon, or at least, well, maybe not over, but in a situation that we can travel, and then, like Professor Massimo said, that we can come together and hug each other. I think we're all missing that very, very much. So thank you for all.
Thank you.
And I think also I have to thank all the organizers. I mean, me and Massimo, of course, we have also organized this thing, but I think Elena Stern, who is behind this, supporting our activities, I think also she's we can't see her now, but I think she has contributed a lot to make these things happen. So thank you for that as well. And yeah, have a nice evening or day, depending where you are actually. So I think some of them are on the other side of Atlantic Ocean. So have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you.